In the middle of the 20th century, the world was changing at a breathtaking pace. Some powers rose, others collapsed, and the global economy swayed like a ship caught in a violent storm. But above this chaos, something else was quietly growing, a force almost invisible at first, a force no one had fully understood yet, a force that would shape the planet's future, a force with a simple name: oil. Once humanity learned how to turn this black gold into energy, it stepped into a new era. Factories roared back to life. Engines hummed. Cities expanded faster than ever before. But convenience came at a price: dependence. And over time, that dependence evolved into a powerful weapon. By the early 1970s, the world was fully hooked on oil, especially the West, the United States and Europe. No one imagined that this addiction could suddenly rewrite the global order. Then came the autumn of 1973. Everything changed. When war erupted between Israel and the Arab states, OPEC nations unveiled their new weapon, an oil embargo. They slashed production and cut supplies to the United States and its allies. Oil prices nearly quadrupled. Gas stations ran dry. Drivers lined up for hours. Cars stalled on highways as tanks emptied. For the first time, the West felt how easily its economy could be switched off with a single move. What looked like a political gesture was, for Washington, a thunderous warning. If they failed to control the global oil system, they would lose control of the world itself. U.S. officials launched urgent negotiations. Behind closed doors, with no press, no transcripts, and no witnesses, they discussed more than just the price of oil. Inside those private rooms, a new global order was being drafted. At the center of it all stood Saudi Arabia, the nation with the world's largest oil reserves, and it was there that the defining secret of the 1970s was born. A secret later known as the birth of the petrodollar. The agreement was surprisingly elegant. Saudi Arabia and OPEC would sell their oil exclusively for US dollars. Not for gold, not for local currencies, only for dollars. In return, Washington promised security, weapons, and unwavering political protection. With this deal, the United States transformed the dollar into the single currency through which the world's energy flowed. Every barrel of oil now required American money. Every country, from Japan to Germany, from India to Brazil, needed dollars to keep its economy running. And to get those dollars, nations had to trade with the United States, borrow from American banks, and store their reserves in U.S. bonds. Oil became the foundation of America's financial empire. Quietly, without fanfare, the dollar rose as the planet's dominant currency. But the most interesting part was something else entirely. The true winners of this new system weren't governments. They were the oil companies, the real kings of the New World Order. The giants of the era, Exxon, Chevron, British Petroleum, Shell, already wielded influence. But with the rise of the petrodollar, they evolved into global superpowers. They controlled exploration, extraction, transportation, and distribution. They held information that even governments couldn't access. They could foresee crises before politicians sensed danger, and they could create crises if it served their interests. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, oil wars were fought not only on the battlefield, but in corporate boardrooms. Decisions made by a handful of executives determined which nations thrived and which descended into turmoil. Some regimes were toppled, some were supported, others were encouraged toward democracy whenever it aligned with corporate goals. Everything changed, except one thing. The flow of petrodollars always returned to the United States. Crises repeated themselves. The Iranian Revolution erupted. Oil prices soared. The Iran-Iraq War began. Prices spiked again. Every conflict, every coup, every explosion on a pipeline benefited those who controlled the world's energy supply. Yet the real battles weren't fought on deserts or seas. They were waged in shadowy rooms with no cameras allowed. There, quotas were negotiated, sanctions drafted, loans approved, and markets carved up. Oil became a currency of power, a weapon used not against people, but against nations. By the end of the 20th century, the petrodollar was so firmly rooted that it seemed eternal. Global trade followed rules written decades earlier, and those rules favored the architects of the 1970s deal. But there was a quieter truth, one rarely spoken aloud. The system rested not only on agreements, but on fear. Fear of another oil crisis, fear of dependency, fear that without the dollar, any economy could collapse. Oil and the dollar became two halves of a single mechanism, a mechanism no nation could escape. Those who tried faced consequences, sanctions, pressure, isolation. Oil companies became the invisible architects of the modern world. They held no political office, yet decisions made in their interests shaped the fate of nations. And even today, in an age of new technologies and emerging resources, this system remains intact. The dollar is still the world's central currency, and oil corporations remain forces that mold not just economies, but geopolitics, conflict zones, and the future of energy itself. The story of the petrodollar is not simply a story about money. It is the story of how a handful of corporations, governments, and secret agreements rewrote the global order, how energy became a tool of control, and how oil, a simple fossil resource, became the most powerful political instrument of the 20th century. But to truly understand how deep this influence runs, we must look at what happened after the 1970s, because the end of the century wasn't just a consolidation, it was a rebirth. A new era of geopolitical experiments, hidden deals, and wars where oil wasn't the goal, but the instrument. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many believed a new age of global cooperation was dawning. But oil corporations and the governments tied to the petrodollar saw something else, a fractured map filled with states rich in untapped oil and gas, nations not yet integrated into the global system. Whoever moved first would gain control over an entirely new energy inheritance. A quiet battle began. Western corporations rushed to sign contracts, privatize fields, build pipelines, and negotiate with new leaders, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through pressure, but always with the same objective: to fold these regions into the petrodollar system, to make them part of the financial machine. Meanwhile, the Middle East reached a boiling point. A wave of conflict swept the region, each with official reasons: democracy, terrorism, national interests. But behind the rhetoric loomed the same familiar shadow: oil. Where energy flowed, interest followed, and where interest appeared, so did struggle. By the 2000s, the petrodollar faced a new threat. Some nations openly declared they no longer wished to sell oil for US dollars. They spoke of euros, gold, or their own currencies. It sounded like an economic decision, but in reality, it challenged the global order itself. If the petrodollar collapsed, the entire financial architecture of the modern world would collapse with it. Too dangerous to allow, and every such challenge ended the same way: pressure, isolation, or war. Sometimes literal war, sometimes revolutions, economic blows, or diplomatic campaigns. Governments negotiated publicly. Oil corporations negotiated privately. Together, they shaped global energy strategy. Sometimes it even seemed that corporations, not states, held the true power. After all, they alone knew the real reserves, the real vulnerabilities, and the real balance of the system. But the world shifted again. New players emerged: China, India, Brazil, fast-growing economies hungry for energy. Their influence grew. Their ambitions expanded. They no longer wanted to be mere consumers. They wanted pipelines, ports, and trade routes of their own. A new front opened: the front of technology. Shale oil in the United States, deepwater rigs, Arctic exploration, innovations that redrew the map of influence. But behind every technological breakthrough stood an old, familiar goal: maintain control over the flow of energy. Oil companies didn't just extract. They lobbied lawmakers, shaped regulations, funded research, and influenced environmental policy. They understood that as long as the world depended on oil, their power would remain unshaken. Then the 21st century delivered an unexpected rival: alternative energy. Solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, a direct threat to an empire built over half a century. Energy could become decentralized. Nations could avoid dependency, and with that, the grip of oil might finally weaken. The corporations responded swiftly. They slowed the transition through lobbying, media campaigns, and regulatory pressure. And despite progress, the petrodollar still stands as one of the pillars of the global economy, because replacing oil means replacing the entire system built around it, and such systems don't vanish overnight. Today, we live in a world where the struggle for resources continues, where oil routes still determine foreign policy, where global conflicts, no matter how local they appear, remain part of a much larger game. A game set in motion by the secret agreements of the 1970s, agreements most people have never even heard of. Oil is no longer just energy. It is the code of global politics, a language nations use to explain their actions, a chessboard on which every move can reshape continents. And though the future leans toward new technologies, the past still holds the world in its grip, a world built on the petrodollar, on hidden negotiations that reshaped history, on corporations that dominated the 20th century and continue to shape the 21st. If this system ever collapses, it won't be a simple financial crisis. It will be a fundamental reordering of the world, as monumental as the upheaval of the 1970s, when oil first became the ultimate instrument of power. Thanks for watching. I hope you've learned something new for yourself. Share your opinion. I will be sincerely glad to read your comments. Have a nice day.